Welcome to this week's edition of Newsbud's Roundtable. This week we'll be taking a look at a recent Newsbud exclusive titled The Disastrous Track Record of the New Leader of the Free World. And we are joined by the author of that article, Christoph, who is a Newsbud analyst and commentator. We are also joined by Professor Filip Kovacevic, who is a senior Newsbud analyst and commentator. And of course we are joined by the founder and editor-in-chief of Newsbud, Sibel Edmonds. Sibel?
Well, I think right now we have two experts with plenty of firsthand information, both firsthand and observational. I want to start with Christoph, because this article analysis was excellent, but it was also very timely. And I haven't seen many reports on Merkel and what's really going on, what has been going on in Germany recently, or when I say recently, I mean post Trump elections. So I think the best point to start this roundtable with would be having Christoph providing us with the synopsis, the core thesis of declining Merkel. Christoph?
Yes, of course, the election of Donald Trump came as a surprise and as a shock to many, including German Chancellor Merkel and large parts of the German political and media establishment. German media has even been more pro-Hillary Clinton than American media, which is very interesting. And it was very interesting to see how the victory of Donald Trump was perceived in Germany. For example, Der Spiegel titling "The End of the World as We Know It." And this was really reflective of the sentiment in large parts of especially the political and media establishment in Germany. And Merkel's statement, her congratulatory message to Donald Trump reflected this. It read more like a warning than a congratulatory message. And Merkel, for example, reminded Trump of the common values that are shared by the United States and Germany and that bound these two countries. And her words were very well received by the establishment press, and the New York Times and others declared Merkel the new leader of the free world, because Donald Trump obviously couldn't take up the role. And Hillary Clinton, unfortunately, didn't win the election. Otherwise, she would, of course, have been the new leader of the free world, according to the Western political and media establishment. The problem is, of course, that Merkel is also facing an election next year in Germany. And she has lost a lot of popularity in Germany. Many of this has to do with her handling of the refugee crisis, but there are also other reasons. For example, her neoliberal policies have hurt a lot of Germans. Although Germany's economy is booming, only the richest people in Germany really benefit from this. The divide between rich and poor is growing, and a lot of people have suffered under Merkel's time in office, even though the German economy has been doing great and Germany is seen in Europe as the strongest economy. Many countries in Europe are, of course, very unhappy with Merkel and her handling of the euro crisis. And this has also caused a lot of turmoil in Europe, and many people in Moscow are also unhappy with Merkel. So there are a lot of things coming together, and there's a lot of stake in the 2017 German federal election.
Well, now that you mentioned Moscow, this is a great point to go to Professor Kovacevic and try to see both sides of this coin. And we know with the US elections, everybody has been, since right before the finalization of elections, talking about Russia factor and Moscow factor. And now you brought it up, Christoph. So can we get the general perspective, what's going on in Russia, and how Russia has been viewing both the political elites, but the public, Germany and Merkel, and then vice versa, also the attitude and the general the relationship status between Germany and Russia with all the recent tensions that we are seeing between the US and Russia?
Thank you, Sibel. As you know, I follow the Russian newspaper scene very closely in my show, The Russian Newspapers Monitor. And occasionally there are articles on Germany in these Russian newspapers. I also follow the way the German media is presented in Russia. In other words, I read the translations of German media in Russian. And from what I have been able to see is that there is more anti-Putin propaganda in Germany than it is anti-Merkel propaganda in Russia at this point. As we know, the elections are coming up in September. So there is plenty of time yet for the anti-Merkel propaganda to rise up in Russia. So let's put this aside. But what we can say right now with certainty is that Merkel appears to have decided to run a political campaign in Germany very similar to the way Hillary Clinton ran her political campaign in the United States. In other words, Merkel is going to have the anti-Russian message as one of the top messages in her political campaign. What does this mean? This means that she is going to try to distract the attention of the German public from many problems that the German people are facing, and Christoph mentioned some of them, the economic problem, the refugee issues, and so on. And she is going to try to distract the German people toward the Russia as an enemy, Russia as a threat. So even at this time, she has begun to talk about the possible cyber Russian intervention in the German elections. And she's being supported in this message by the new BND chief, Bruno Kahl, BND being the Federal Intelligence Service in Germany. And let me just make a note here that Bruno Kahl is a new appointee. The other person who was in charge for a long time, his name was Gerhard Schindler, and he was forced out in April. It appears that from the BBC, it appears that he was too lenient to the Americans, to the NSA and the CIA. But I think that was not the real reason. I think Bruno Kahl may even be more friendly to the US intelligence community than Schindler. So what we are seeing in Germany at this point of time is the setting up of a political message for the next election that's going to say, you know, Russia is our enemy. Russia is going to try to destabilize Germany. And this is why we have to stick with the tried and true person, Angela Merkel. You know, don't change the horses in the midstream. Remember that movie, Wag the Dog? Yeah, that's going to be the message in Germany, I think.
Well, that's very interesting. So, Christoph, are we talking about mainly the mainstream German media and the government in this attitude towards Russia? Or do you see that many people, the public, they actually is falling for it and they are perceiving, their perception is identical to what the mainstream over there is feeding them?
No, there's a huge disconnect between public opinion and what media and governments are saying. And this really escalated during the Ukrainian conflict. This was really the first time when German public opinion deviated to a really large extent from the message that was being put out by the media. And this was also the time when really the trust in the mainstream media in Germany really hit a new low. And ever since then, it has only gotten worse with the refugee crisis. And then you had, of course, the anti-refugee sentiments. played a huge role in this, and the new political party that emerged, an alternative for Germany, which made this term lying press, Lügenpresse, popular in Germany. So there has been a huge disconnect between the public and the political class and the media establishment, especially on the topic of Russia, and especially on Russian relations. And that's one thing that the Social Democrats, which are a partner of Merkel's Christian Democratic Union in the current government, are reportedly looking to exploit in the 2017 election. As I mentioned in the previous article for Newsbud, there have been some reports suggesting that they are planning to run a Russia-friendly election campaign, saying no to more sanctions, yes to more talks, and essentially scaling down the escalation. And that means, of course, breaking from the US-NATO line on Russia, and that's going to cause a lot of problems, of course, in the West and for NATO. And that's why many in the West, especially in the Baltics and Ukraine, have been they have been very outraged when they saw these reports in German media suggesting that the Social Democrats are going to scale down the new Cold War.
Well, we have been seeing these refugee crises, and especially in Germany, but also since Ukraine, we have been, according to the media, we have been witnessing the rise of the ultra-right. Now, how does that movement and that kind of escalation and the rise in ultra-right faction, first of all, is it true? Or if it is, then how does that fit within this coming elections and what we are witnessing?
It's really difficult to say. There have been, of course, these movements like Pegida, for example, which has become very popular in Germany, and the New Alternative for Germany, which are more or less driven by the same people. These movements and parties draw their support to a large extent from disenchanted people who are fed up with the political and media establishment. Many of them have been hurt, of course, economically by the policies that have been pursued over the last years. And these people are, of course, a wild card in the next elections. We don't know how many of them are going to vote, and if they are going to vote, they're probably going to vote for the Alternative for Germany, the AfD. And this party could take a lot of votes away from Merkel's Christian Democratic Party. Currently, Merkel's party is polling at around between 30 and 35%, and the Alternative for Germany is polling between 10 and 15%, but it's really difficult to predict how many votes they are going to win. And it's really, really difficult to predict the outcome of the next elections. Currently, the Social Democrats, which are the strongest opponent of Merkel, but at the same time, currently the coalition partner, they are polling at only around 22%, and they really have to find something to distance themselves from Merkel's party, because they have, of course, supported all her policies so far, and they really have to find something to get more support from the public.
Filip, I have a couple of questions. Actually, one of them is going to be a follow-up to the other one. So I'm going to start with the general one. And during the whole Bush presidency for 8 years, especially from the mainstream media, from the liberal media, we kept hearing this buzzword, neocons, neoconservatives. Well, since Obama, I know among the intellectual elites and academia, we hear the buzzword neoliberals, okay? However, not much from the media. So while the US mainstream media loved using neoconservative, Bush's neoconservative agenda or its neoconservative foreign policy agendas, we don't see the same thing, same practice applying to neoliberalism, because whether New York Times or Washington Post, they somehow don't touch that word. It's as if it's a sacred word. And with some of these words, for some people, or maybe for many people, maybe some of them don't admit, it becomes like this abstract thing. So they were the neocons and we dealt with that. who are these neoliberals, both in terms of the US and other European countries. Can you just brief us, the viewers, on the whole concept of who are the neoliberals? What is neoliberalism all about? And from there, then we can move in to neoliberalism specifically as it applies to Germany, and as Christoph has mentioned a couple of times in his article.
Great question, Sibel. There is a lot of confusion on these conceptual issues in the media and also in the public sphere. This is done on purpose. This is done by the sophisticated intelligence operatives to confuse people so that they don't know the difference between neoliberals, neoconservatives, conservatives, liberals, and so on and so on. In other words, the idea is to confuse and misinform, and in the end to fool them into making political choices that will keep up the operations of the deep state and the establishment. Basically, neoliberalism is an economic doctrine. It's an idea that the best way to proceed in economy is to privatize as much as possible of the economy. This doctrine was applied by the IMF and the World Bank to different regions of the world, especially Eastern Europe, Asia, and Africa, especially the former socialist systems. The problem with this is that people are losing a lot of social security net programs that they have come to depend on. So neoliberalism meant austerity measures in most of these countries. It meant that social security was cut, pensions were cut, the education was made more expensive, healthcare was made more expensive, and so on. And it appears that, looking at it globally, neoliberalism as an economic doctrine has failed. It has led to the crisis, the huge financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, and we are still essentially recovering from the consequences of the crisis. So neoliberalism has pretty much been discredited. Neoconservatism is linked to geopolitics, and it's linked to the idea that the United States has to be the policeman of the world, that the United States is the indispensable nation in the world, that nothing in the world can be done without the United States intervening and telling other countries what to do. And neoconservatism pretty much has also been discredited, except in some think tanks in Washington, D.C., like the CFR and the Atlantic Council. By the way, they are still very powerful, and they'll try everything they can to subvert the possible détente between the United States and Russia that the new president might try to implement. We still don't know whether Donald Trump will remain faithful to his words and will try to develop better working relations with Russia. But even based on his rhetoric, many people in Washington, D.C. will oppose him. He is going to face a lot of opposition in the U.S. Congress by both parties. And this is also happening in Germany. You have the establishment parties, like the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats. And by the way, they are in a coalition. I mean, they're together. So can you really expect a different foreign policy from Social Democrats and from Christian Democrats? I think you can. And I think Martin Schulz, one of the possible, front runners for the Chancellor from the Social Democrats is Martin Schulz, he is the president of the European Parliament. And under his direction, the European Parliament has just recently voted a resolution that put the Russian media next to the media of the Islamic State. So can you really expect of Martin Schulz to do anything meaningful in terms of having a better relationship with Russia? I think you can. I think the only hope for a better relationship can come from the parties outside of the mainstream, whether from the left or from the right. We are talking about populist political parties. We are talking about political parties that have the same message that Donald Trump had in the United States. And so we have to see whether, I think it is just too early for Germany to have a, maybe it's too early to talk about it, but I'm not seeing the trend in Germany in this election. But I'm seeing it in the next election for sure. And let's not forget that in Germany, this is the parliamentary system. In other words, you have to get the majority of deputies in the parliament to form a government. So if let's say the populist parties do well, they may be able to influence the establishment parties to form a government where more of the populists will be represented. However, I think this is going to be very difficult to do in Germany, because Germany, by the way, as you all know, is still an occupied country. There are so many US military bases in Germany still. And the German elite is under the boot of NATO establishment, both social democrats and Christian democrats. Every year, the General Secretary of NATO is giving them speeches, is going to their conventions and giving speeches for them, both one and the other. So it's gonna be easier in France. It's going to be much easier in France to get a president who will make a deal with the Russians rather than in Germany. Germany may be the last country in Europe. And this is so tragic and sad, because Germany and Russia have had so many traumatic things happen to them in the past. And they have to be on the same side for us, for the Europeans and the world, to avoid having another confrontation between the Russians and the Germans, which works to the detriment of both.
This is a good point. This is a good point to go back to Christoph. And do you observe any anti-NATO sentiment, or is it on the rise? And if so, which one of the parties currently in Germany would be considered closer to that kind of a vision than, let's say, the establishment neoliberals and even the social democrats that Filip just mentioned? But have you been observing any anti-NATO sentiment, especially with Syria situation, with refugee situation, on the rise in Germany or not?
That's difficult to say. So we have in Germany 5 or 6 political parties that are expected to pass the 5% threshold to get into parliament. We have Merkel's Christian Democratic Union, which is the strongest party, somewhere between 30 and 35%. Then the Social Democrats at around 22%. The Green Party, which is a former coalition partner of the Social Democrats, at around 11%. The Left Party, which is the most critical of NATO, which is standing for this anti-NATO sentiment. They are polling at around 10%. And the new anti-immigration party, the Alternative for Germany, between 10 and 15%. It's hard to predict what they are going to do in terms of foreign policy. Publicly, they are, of course, calling for better relations with Russia, but it's a new party. You never know how these parties are going to act once they are in power. And then we have the Free Democratic Party, former coalition partner of Merkel's CDU. They are not represented in the current parliament. It didn't make it in the last elections, and they are currently polling at around 5%. As I said, most of these parties are very similar, with the exception of the Left Party and the Alternative for Germany. But for example, Merkel's CDU, the SPD, the Green Party, and the Free Democratic Party, they are very similar, not just in terms of foreign policy, but in general. And that's, of course, one of the major problems that many voters are facing, not only in Germany. So regardless of which party you voted for neoliberal policies, and you voted for an aggressive US-aligned foreign policy. And that's very interesting, what Professor Kovacevic just said about the social Democrats, that we are probably not going to see a major shift in their foreign policy. We've seen this movie before. in the 2002 German federal election, the Social Democrats, they publicly said no to the US war in Iraq. And that helped them. That helped the Social Democratic Party and the Green Party, which were the governing coalition at the time, to win these 2002 German federal elections and to retain a narrow majority. What many voters didn't realize was that the Schröder-led government still supported the war in Iraq in various ways. For example, by allowing the United States to use airports and military bases in Germany for this illegal war of aggression, thereby violating the German constitution. And Germany's foreign intelligence agency, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, even helped Americans spy out targets for US bombs in Iraq. However, for Angela Merkel, this wasn't good enough. It's very likely that German troops would have invaded Iraq alongside American and British forces if Merkel had been Chancellor at the time. As I mentioned in my recent article for Newsbud, in September 2002, Merkel delivered one of the most disgusting speeches to the German Bundestag that I've ever seen. Among other things, she invoked the horrors of Auschwitz to drum up support for the Iraq war, saying stuff like, have you forgotten that Saddam Hussein's stated goal is to destroy Israel? So even before Merkel became Chancellor of Germany, you could already see what her foreign policy would look like. Staunch pro-US, staunch pro-Israel with complete disregard for Germany's national interest. And that's, of course, one of the reasons why Merkel is very popular with large parts of the Western political and media establishment. And just to pick up on another thing that Professor Kovacevic said, last year, Stratfor founder George Friedman was asked if Islamic extremism is really the major threat to the United States. And his response was, no, Islamic extremism is a problem, but not a big threat. And he went on to explain that the primordial interest of the United States has been to prevent an alliance between Germany and Russia because united, they are the only force that could threaten the United States, as Friedman put it. And as he also pointed out, major wars in the last century, both World Wars and the Cold War, have been fought over this relationship between Germany and Russia. And this struggle is still continuing to this day. At the end of the Second World War, Germany obviously lost its sovereignty. And even though on paper Germany became fully sovereign in 1991, Germany has not really regained its full sovereignty to this day, more than 70 years after the end of the Second World War and 25 years after the end of the Cold War. The United States still has more than 30,000 troops, more than 30 military installations, and even US nuclear bombs in Germany. The United States Africa Command is headquartered in Stuttgart in Germany. And I think everyone knows about the importance of Ramstein Air Base for United States military operations around the world. And this is only possible due to the support from Germany's political leadership. Just to give an example, for decades, local residents have been fighting for the removal of US nuclear bombs in Germany, and the overwhelming majority of the German population wants to see the nukes gone. This led the Free Democratic Party to call for the bombs removal during the 2009 election campaign. And the 2009 government of Merkel's Christian Democratic Union and the Free Democratic Party included nuclear disarmament in its coalition agreement. And in 2010, the German parliament agreed with overwhelming majority that the Merkel-led government should tell the Americans to remove the bombs, but nothing happened. What neither the parliament nor the public knew at the time was that Merkel had already personally assured Washington that the bombs could stay in Germany, as WikiLeaks cables later revealed. And today, the US nukes are still in Germany, and instead of removing the bombs, the US wants to modernize them. As I said, that's only possible because people like Merkel support it. And there's a reason for this support from Germany's political and media elites for this kind of behavior. After the end of the Second World War, the United States began nurturing elites in Germany that are very sympathetic towards the United States and Israel. To this end, they established several organizations that promote Atlanticism. For example, the Atlantic Brücke. And new political, media, and business elites in Germany are being groomed with the help of these pro-American networks. And the media plays an important part in this. For example, the Axel Springer SE, one of the largest publishing houses in Europe, follows 5 principles. The second of which is to promote reconciliation of Jews and Germans and support the vital rights of the State of Israel. And the third of which is to support a transatlantic alliance and solidarity with the United States of America in the common values of free nations. Needless to say, the Axel Springer SE, which publishes the Bild tabloid and Die Welt, has been one of the strongest supporters of Merkel and is very influential in driving German public opinion. That's one of the reasons why it's very easy for someone like Merkel to rise to the top. And it's very difficult for someone who stands for better relations with Russia, for example, to rise to the top in German politics.
Enlightening, Christoph. Thank you for pointing this out and providing this example. Now, let's look at it from the geopolitical perspective, Professor Kovacevic. Now, I don't know exactly the percentage of dependency for energy when it comes to Germany and Russia. But we have been hearing lots of talk, and the conclusion of this agreement between Turkey and Russia on the pipeline, the new pipeline project, which is going to come go straight to Europe. But with the escalating tensions between Germany and Turkey, because lately Germany has been saying basically we shouldn't even consider Turkey's candidacy for EU, which I think is a great thing for Turkey personally. I believe a lot of people in Turkey would say we don't want to be part of this. Actually, we are right now witnessing countries wanting to get out of this hellhole. Now we don't want to get into it, but with that escalation, the tension between Germany and Turkey, and of course the ongoing tension that has been escalating as well between Germany and Russia with the United States influence, how does geopolitics and the energy and the pipeline configure into all this? I mean, how much power does Russia have? For example, they are talking about, Germany is going along supporting U.S. sanctions on Russia, etc. But if it were to come to really serious confrontation, not wars, but let's say energy wars, how much leverage Russia has in terms of what we call starving Europe of energy?
In order to understand what is going on and not to be confused, in order to figure out what the head is and what the tail is, we have to start with some basic ideas, basic fundamental ideas, and then build from there. The first idea is that in order for the United States and Britain to be able to exert their power over Europe, they have to work on subverting the alliance between Berlin and Moscow. This is the basic fundamental building block. In other words, whatever brings Berlin and Moscow together will be subverted by Washington and London. This has been the case for a very, very long time. And the logic is simple. It's economic. The natural potentials of Russia, the resources, the oil, the gas, the gold, the minerals, is vast. And Germany has the vast industrial machine, the production, the manufacturing, the engineering, the new technologies. So if you could get them together, you could, and of course adding France and China to this, and they would probably join it if they see the alliance, the fundamental axis, Berlin-Moscow, then you essentially have a new type of world. You don't have anymore the Anglo-American domination of the world that's basically running the world since, let's say, sometime before World War I. And so all the other things, all the other dots will be connected if you look at it from this perspective. So in terms of Germany and Turkey, Germany and Russia, there are so many players who are trying to muddy the waters. Let's say as soon as Russia and Turkey start cooperating, you got Germany attacking Turkey, and then Russia wants to be friends with Germany, and then they also attack Turkey. So you have so many equations, so many things going on at the same time. But the fundamental things are the following. The continental Eurasian perspective says to construct the axis Paris, Berlin, Moscow, Beijing, with Ankara being there too. And this could be the bloc that determines the fate of the world. The United States and Britain, being pretty much the island nations, cannot do much about it. In terms of energy, we have seen the business community of Germany suffering because of the sanctions against Russia. And so it could be, just like in the United States, it could be the business community actually pushing the politicians to make a deal with Russia. So, and this is what happened during the Cold War. When Reagan was in charge, was the president of the United States, it was actually the business community that pushed him to make a deal with the Soviet Union, which in the end led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which nobody expected, not even Reagan. So it was a very smart decision on his part. In terms of the concrete cooperation, you got something called the Nord Stream, the pipeline that connects Germany and Russia directly. And now there is talk about building a second pipeline, the Nord Stream 2. But there are so many forces, the forces that I talked about, the Atlantic network, that's against the building of this second pipeline. So at this point of time, the work on the second pipeline has been stalled. We also have to look at something that's very important, which is the position of Joe Biden in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet space. We know for a fact that the son of Joe Biden received a high position within the Ukrainian energy company. And it is in the interest of this energy company in Ukraine for this second pipeline between Russia and Germany not to be built. Because if there is this second pipeline connecting Russia and Germany, then Ukraine will lose a lot of its potential to put pressure on Russia. Because as you know, so much of the gas that went from Russia into Europe had to go through Ukraine because all of the pipelines there. So what we are seeing is perhaps two oligarchic business groups fighting for domination. One that's dominated, but let's say by kind of the U.S. companies held by Joe Biden, and the other, which is based on this relationship between the German businessmen and businesswomen and the same people in Russia. It's still pretty much in the air what's going to happen. But as Christoph pointed out, since the end of the World War II, so much money was invested on the part of the United States to shape and form a new German elite that will have the allegiance to the US-dominated world as a matter of fact. The German Marshall Fund of the United States is one of the key intellectual think tanks pushing for NATO expansion. The Atlantic Council is the second one. So this is going to be very difficult. It's going to be very difficult to deconstruct and to construct a new German elite. This is why I'm afraid that we may see another war in Europe before the people of goodwill like us get the chance to talk about possible alternatives and to see them implemented.
Well, this is a good point to wrap up this discussion with 1 minute for each one of you, Christoph and Professor Kovacevic. I know you said it's too early to predict. I know you said it's going to take much longer than when the election is coming up with Merkel. But let's say, because we're going to regroup and we're going to revisit this in the next few months. But if you were to say between now and the end of next year, 2017, December, what is your prediction for Germany? And that includes the elections that are coming up there, but also post-Trump presidency, getting into the White House, acceptance officially after January. And then after you will go to Christoph. And doesn't matter if it's going to sound like a crystal ball, it's okay. We can come back, revisit it in 3-4 months from now and actually have fun with it. Professor Kovacevic?
Well, I'd like Christoph to go first.
Okay, I'm afraid that Donald Trump's election victory will actually help Merkel, because she's now being perceived also by large parts of the population in Germany as a guarantor of stability, of the status quo. And many people are afraid of what someone like Donald Trump might bring. So they are going to project this on the political parties in Germany, like the Alternative for Germany, which I'm also not a big fan of, but I think that might hurt the populist parties in Germany. And I'm afraid this will strengthen Merkel's party, and we will probably see another grand coalition between Merkel's Christian Democratic Union and the Social Democrats.
Fair enough. Professor?
What we'll see in Germany in the coming period is the more and more of anti-Russian rhetoric. There will be more talk about the so-called hybrid warfare, covert operations, political and financial support for the right populists and the leftist parties, even the instrumentalization of the Russian diaspora in Germany. In order, just as Christoph said, in order to make people afraid that unless you vote for the people you know about, for the crooks you know about, something even worse is going to happen. So we have to depend on the judgment of the German people. We have to depend on their judgment to decide to be free from occupation. Liberate yourselves. You've got the economic potential. You've got a history of philosophy and art and intellectual culture, second to none in Europe. And so I think politically it's time for Germany to get emancipated and to liberate itself from the policies that are hurting the German people. They're very beneficial for the elites, but they are hurting the German people. So we may, in my opinion, it's more likely that we'll see some changes in France, and that we may see the shaping up of the axis Paris-Moscow before we see the shaping up of the axis of Berlin-Moscow. But I also have to say another thing to complicate everything a little bit, because this is very complicated. Hollande, French President Hollande, refused to meet with Putin in October. And so Putin, you know where Putin went? Putin went to Berlin instead. So Angela Merkel was happy to host Putin, whereas Hollande wasn't too happy about it. And so the Minsk agreements, the negotiations of the Minsk-Ukraine agreements took place in Germany in October 2016. And Putin was there. And not only was Putin there, but his advisor, Vladislav Surkov, who he's on the list of the EU sanctions. He is prohibited from visiting the EU, but he was there in Berlin with Putin. In other words, Merkel was willing to violate her own decisions and laws to have Putin in Berlin. So there could be more things going on. There could be more things going on. But I think in the end, the final analysis is that the German people have to say no to the establishment parties, to the corrupt old establishment parties. Because if they vote for social democrats instead of Christian democrats, they will be deceived. If they vote for Christian democrats, they'll continue to be deceived. So in my opinion, the only option is to vote for the parties outside of the mainstream. The leftists, or even the rightist populists, which are not to my liking, but they have different messages that point to the same thing, which is the liberation of Germany from the outside control. This is what we all want as individuals, to be free from the outside control. So what we want for us, we also should want for the communities we live in.
There's definitely a lot riding on the upcoming elections in Germany, which will be taking place in 2017. We're very happy to have our own analyst on the ground there in Germany, Christoph Germann. As Sibel said, we're going to be following up on this as the election nears. Like we said, there's a lot riding on it. It seems that everyone wants to point the fingers and blame Russia for everything, every election so far here recently. And truth is that it appears that other countries, Western nations, like specifically NATO countries or the U.S., would have a lot riding on this election as well. So again, I'd like to thank our guests, Professor Filip Kovacevic, Christoph Germann, and I'm always joined with Sibel Edmonds. Stay tuned for next week's edition of Newsbud Roundtable, and remember, Newsbud is 100% people-supported. Join the Newsbud community today. Coming up soon, Newsbud is going to be offering exclusive content to the Newsbud community.